We ran the experiment, we looked at the results, and everyone's like, what do we do now? That's a failed experiment. An experiment where we test something and it doesn't work out, but we got a clean read and we're like, oh, this doesn't solve the customer problem. Here is why it doesn't work. That's success if we learn something.
I'm Jeff Steinberg, Principal Consultant at Adaptivity, where we help organizations gain the capability to change, adapt, and thrive in today's fast-moving world. Today, I'm thrilled to share a conversation with my good friend Matt Sternberg. He's Vice President of Product and Marketplace at Rover. And for those of you who don't know, Rover is the world's largest network of pet care providers. They're connecting pet parents with trusted sitters and walkers. Rover's also a company that, in my opinion, has truly embraced a product-led operating model. They've built empowered product teams, fostered a culture of collaboration and innovation, and really, they put customer value at the heart of everything they do. So for me, they're a shining example of what so many of our clients are aspiring to achieve. In this episode, Matt shares his insights on what makes Rover so successful, the principles that guide their work, and how they've created an organization capable of adapting and thriving in a rapidly evolving world. So whether you're a product manager, a team leader, or an executive, there's a ton to take away from this conversation. So let's dive in. Matt, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Your journey from nuclear physics to data science and now leading product at Rover, it's a fascinating tale. Can you share about how that transition unfolded?
Sure. Before I moved into data science and product, I was a nuclear particle physicist. I spent about a decade of my life doing that. And when I went into physics, really, was kind of unexpected. I thought I'd go into maybe business or maybe the family business. I grew up in basically a startup. My parents started their own sausage company. So when I was like 12, I'd come downstairs in the morning to people taste testing Polish sausages. Help my parents with, at some point or other, with almost every part of the business and like sales and trade shows and managing the office and all those things. I stumbled onto physics because I just fell in love with it. It was the most fascinating thing I could do in college. And I had always figured I would do it as long as it made sense for me. And on a personal level, and figured I would learn a skill set that would be adaptable to something else. And a little over a decade ago, was just struggling to raise a family and was on an academic salary and started to pick my head up and look at what I could do outside of academia, and went and joined a friend of mine who was working at a marketplace tech startup in Seattle called Porch. And I had no idea what to expect. But I was really excited to learn, take a lot of the technical skills I have, learn data science, be in a product organization. What I found was that a lot of what I'd been trained to do as a experimental physicist actually adapted really, really well to product and to data science. In terms of mapping out hard, complex, ambiguous problems and figuring out how do you figure out what to prioritize. Like, you can do anything when you're building a product, and you can do anything when you're in the laboratory, but you usually have some really clear and focused outcome that you're trying to get to. And the question is, like, what's the sequence of events? What's the strategy and what's the approach I should take so that I don't find out that I've spent 5 years like working on the wrong problem, right? And so that is a lot of the challenge of product. Funny enough, when I made that transition, I think you were probably my most important mentor. I mean, I was reaching out to you all the time with like, this is dysfunctional. My team's working on the wrong stuff. I'm having trouble with this other team prioritizing. I don't have the resources that I think I need to be successful just on the way we're organized. We're not focused on the customer problems. Like, you helped reorient me through phone calls, especially in my first 3 or 4 years, making that transition that really helped anchor me against, kind of lean startup mantra of like, what's the customer problem you're trying to solve? And how are you going to fail fast? And how are you going to validate things as quickly as possible to stay focused on whatever outcome you're trying to get to? But I love that transition, and naturally, I think a tech product-led tech organization, data science is most effective when it's integrated with the product. And so the paths towards influencing the product in positive ways and achieving positive business outcomes came down to how good of a job could we do at integrating data science into the products that we were delivering. And that meant getting closer to our PMs, closer pulling engineering in. And eventually over time, I found that the lines between the two had blurred to the point where I was a leader of both data science, analytics, and product.
Mm. That's really interesting. I love this part about your academic background influencing the way you approach product now. Let me first ask you, so, at Rover, product managers are highly empowered. What does that empowerment look like day to day?
Oh, that's a great question. When we hire product managers, it starts with like, what are the teams we're building and what do we hire for? And we hire for individuals who are very outcomes oriented. They're focused on delivering an outcome. They have strong ownership, really good analytical acumen, and good at working through ambiguous problems. And why does all that matter? It matters because we think of those as the ingredients that help enable empowerment that can be effective. Like, that's the rounded skill set that we need so that we can, as an organization, align on a set of strategic objectives, strategic outcomes that we're trying to go towards. They might be customer problems that we're trying to solve that we know are core to our product and our offering and our customers' experience. They could be business problems that we're trying to solve. But empowerment day to day means like going from that layer to being able to put that in somebody's hands where we can then trust them with the decision making throughout, right? So that they day to day can start to take those objectives and become our subject matter experts. Meaning, we may say, we need to go acquire more customers in this segment, or here's a customer set that's failing. What we want them to do then is say, okay, I've got this entire set of tools that I can build really robust business cases around, and I can independently action and formulate those ideas and not be beholden to, from the top, us just pushing down or cramming, like, build this feature, build this thing, as opposed to, can we all align on this is the outcome that we're trying to get to? Do we all deeply understand why? If not, let's stop there. But once we get to that, then it becomes about putting more power and autonomy in their hands, and us as a leadership team being there to facilitate, to make sure that there aren't any blockers, that things are efficient, that we're making the right trade-off decisions when things bump into problems around the organization, and that all those things are staying connected to the strategic outcomes of the business. And if they are, then great. We're going to do everything we can to enable them and flip it from like they're doing what we ask to we're there to serve them, to make sure that things aren't getting blocked and they're able to move efficiently and effectively to build the things that they've landed on.
So how does leadership support autonomy while also ensuring the alignment across the teams? And it's a tough
Oh
balance.
yeah, I mean that's like the hardest. That's the hardest thing. There's a couple of different pieces that we have there. One is, starts with, is everybody clear about this? What the strategic objectives are across the organization? So if there's lanes of work going on, we want to make sure everyone deeply understands why. We'll have to make trade-offs. There will be conflicts. There will be things that bump into each other around the organization. To start, we want to make sure that everybody understands the why, because it's going to make global prioritization or navigating those conflicts easier. Um, then it's two ways. It's, let's make sure we understand and have visibility across all the roadmaps. So from the bottom up, do we have a way of seeing the roadmaps across the different teams out into the future at a long enough time scale that we can hopefully foresee some of the conflicts that are going to rise, the edges of where teams are going to bump into each other? That took a long time. I think when I came to Rover 6 years ago, I think we were probably planning mostly on a monthly cycle. Took a lot of time to shift that to quarterly and then halfly. Now we do OKRs. We just recently shifted to halfly OK, doing check-ins throughout. But it took a long time to move to the point where we were able to see out on the horizon of 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, and do longer term planning and plan bigger and larger projects and bodies of work and help make sure that unfolds. And then the other one is making sure we're connected on the narratives that are coming up throughout the respective teams so we can move quickly and change. So what I don't want you to hear is, oh, we've moved to like halfly or yearly planning cycles, and so we have to be slow because of that. The objectives and the strategy should be pretty enduring over larger time scales. We're going to learn stuff every week, and it's going to be disruptive to our roadmaps, which means that that flow of information up has to be effective out of the teams, that they're sharing what they're learning and they're not afraid to then say, hey, I think we're going to do something different than we said at the beginning of the quarter. But they committed to an outcome. They didn't commit to the project. So we're okay with that. And then just work through the tough stuff, because oftentimes when that happens, it's going to collide with another team's roadmap. They weren't planning for you to shift what you were building, and all of a sudden you're going to need to touch a different part of the tech stack that some other team is developing in. And so that's the adventure day to day. But we try not to keep our heads in the sand. Got to like talk and share these things across the organization.
How does Rover decide where to focus its efforts? I mean, especially when you're balancing short-term goals with long-term product vision.
A couple of different places. One is, as I mentioned before, we start with what are the strategic outcomes that we're trying to get to? What are the big strategic problems for the business that we have to solve? Things that we think are imperatives to long-term growth, core customer problems that we feel like we need to solve, and things like that. And we make sure to align on that as an organization, and then land the why. So that's the first. The second thing we do is, before we even go through our planning cycles, we align on distribution, what we think the portfolio should look like at a high level. Like, we're not going to solve for, it should be exactly this much short term and this much long term and this much medium term. But even some of our strategic objectives will often have some things we want to achieve in a year and some things that are larger problems that we want to solve over a longer time horizon. And that even starts to help color what the resource allocation is going to look like in terms of distributions across timescales of returns and risk profiles of those returns. So we, for example, we don't want our portfolio to be all high risk, high reward bets. And then go, okay, we're going to roll into the year placing 5 high risk, high reward bets that could all fail, and then have nothing to show, no progress for our customers. And our customers have a lot of things they would like us to build for them. Like that would just be kind of heartbreaking on its own to go out there and be like, we did all these speculative things, we didn't solve any of your day-to-day problems. But then a lot of the features that they want day to day, there might be bigger things that we could do, bigger shots that we could take that might be more transformative for them and high risk. So there we might think about what slice of the pie should we be putting those high risk resources against? What might be going against near term things that are likely to drive profit in the near term, but hopefully will still be enterprise kind of value maximizing in the long term. And then some things that are more somewhere in between, like we have a high degree of confidence maybe in the underlying business problems, slightly lower on our ability to solve them and know that it may take a year or two to work out those problems. And we get clear on that ahead of time. And then through our strategic planning process, as we see what are all the things that we could be investing in, we start to prioritize those things against how do they line up against the distribution, what's our confidence, what's the risk profile, how strong are the business cases, and how well does it line up against our strategic objectives.
So then how do you maintain transparency into the product strategy and the whole decision-making process there?
Well, one, we tell our product teams this is exactly what we're doing. So before we go into strategic planning, we share out the kind of top-down strategic guidance. We take a lot of time with them, make sure they deeply understand the why, invite them to ask questions. Even before we get to setting those things, those are developed by narratives that are kind of created by our product teams. Not even kind of, they are created by our product teams. So we'll run strategy sessions with maybe significant problems in the business that we have or challenges that we've experienced, and our product leaders and sometimes our ICPMs are in the room, like hashing those things out and helping us figure out what do we actually believe. That helps us craft what we think are the right strategic objectives. And by the time we share those out with the broader product team, I think a good outcome is for them to go, well, no shit, right? Because they've been a part of the process enough and helping to define those things. They shouldn't be surprised. Uh-huh. They might say, hey, there's another thing that I wish we were prioritizing above those things because we have to pick a finite set. We can't try to do everything. So there's going to be a cut list, and people are going to have feelings and emotions about the cut list. But part of it is we're talking about resource allocation of finite resources, but there will always be really compelling things below the cut list. Focus is really important. So that's the first thing. Can we get alignment with that team on focus? And then what we ask our teams to help us do is put together all the potential things we could invest in. Like, forget the boundaries of your own individual teams. And this is where earlier we were talking about trying to hire PMs who embrace ambiguity. And one of Rover's values as well is no office politics. Like, we don't want folks trying to land grab and build their teams and think about just how can I pull more into my team. We instead want them to kind of ignore the boundaries of their teams, which means a high degree of ambiguity, to come to the table and say, okay, some of this might be based on your domain expertise, what's within your team, but some of it's based on the customer research you've touched. And for us to build it, it would have to be beyond what your team could do. And we try to get those teams to bring all that stuff to the table in our strategic planning process. And then from there, and then we communicate this out to our teams. From there, we're going to go look across all of that portfolio potential of investments and then align on where we're going to put our resources. And then we go and do that as a leadership team and bring that back to the teams for some additional feedback, and then to figure out how are we going to go operationalize this.
That's amazing. So tell me more. So how does data get woven into the fabric of Rover's product life cycle? From discovery to delivery?
Man, it's almost a hard question for me to answer because it's so ever present throughout the whole thing. I can't even like divorce the two. So where does it start? Um, I mean, business cases can arrive from anywhere. They can arrive from our user research team talking to customers. They can arise from our design team and vision work that they've done, which again probably has a lot to do with talking to our customers, analysis of uh, different parts of our product funnel, any of those things. But once we've identified a customer problem that we want to solve, it's every PM's obligation to design a business case around the thing. Like, what share of customers are impacted? Can you identify that with data we have directly in our product? If not, um, let's go talk to customers. Let's go survey customers. There's so many different sources of data we can get to. And so depending on the investment we want to make, it could be highly ambiguous. We're not going to have any data on our platform, but it doesn't mean we can't get data and start to frame it up. Or it can be things where we're like, hey, this is a conversion rate on the checkout page. We know exactly what it is. We know how much time they're spending. We know where they're getting stuck. And so we can get really, really pointed where if like, okay, if I can fix this problem, a PM might be able to say, I think I'll get X in conversion rates, to the point where they're willing to sign up for something in our budget because they're so confident um, in what they've seen. On the other end of the spectrum, when it comes to the more like highly speculative things, we think about both the research we can do up front, but then if we're going to start building and testing, we often build and test in frameworks of what we call learning objectives. So what are the things that we need to know that are the backbones of like the unit economics of how this thing is going to work? Or if it's going to actually solve this customer problem, we would need to see X happen. And so then we'll actually set up a set of objectives in those areas that are all about learning to help us get to the answer as quickly as possible of, are we building the right thing? Should we be investing in this further? Or if there's a bunch of open-ended decisions that we don't know how to make right now, they're giving us information to inform those open-ended decisions. Mm-hmm. So that's early on in the kind of development of a business case, and quantifying those things helps us with prioritization. When we go to build, we are we're pretty obsessed with testing and measurement. It doesn't mean that everything gets tested, but every substantive product change that we make minimally gets reviewed by a group of analysts and PMs and designers in something we call test console, where they will go and they'll present, here's the product change, and an analyst and a PM paired together will share their plan for how they're going to experiment. How's the experiment going to be structured? Or occasionally they'll say, we're not going to test it. We're so confident, we've seen X, Y, and Z. Here's what we'll do to ensure that there aren't any bugs in the release. Maybe they'll monitor something. But in those cases, they usually have done a pretty robust analysis to say, here's why we don't think we need to experiment, that we can go faster. But probably most of the time, our default is to experiment. And then we follow very, very rigorous internal standards around that. And then with that same group, they'll come back after the test is done to say, here's what we observed. Here's how it lines up with our predefined decision-making framework. Here's our recommendation on what to do next. And the reason we set it up that way, and we set it up as a group, is because there's no like perfectly formulaic way to go test and do experimentation in product. You're inevitably going to come up with tons of different edge cases, tests that come back neutral, things that you need to build because it's a stepping stone to what you want to do long term, but in the short term has the risk of churning customers instead of converting them and things like that. And so with all the different ways and types of experiments that you can have, we want to have an environment where PMs, designers, analysts, and engineering managers can get exposure to the learning from that. Like, what are the tests that we set up incorrectly? What were the mistakes we made? What are the debates we had around difficult decisions? What are the cases where we didn't actually define a really good decision-making framework? So we ran the experiment, we looked at the results, and everyone's like, what do we do now? Like, that's a failed experiment to me. An experiment where we test something and it doesn't work out, but we got a clean read and we're like, oh, this doesn't solve the customer problem.
Mhm.
Here is why it doesn't work. That's success if we learn something. The failures in testing is like, you went and you ran a test and you looked at the data and you're like, we can't make heads or tails of it. And by the way, had we done our homework before we ran the test, we would have known that this was going to happen. We would have known that we were going to look at the data and we were never going to be able to make a decision with it.
Uh-huh.
And so
So
that's hard.
when that goes wrong, I mean, obviously it's an opportunity to continuously improve, but do you run it again?
Sometimes, sometimes we'll restructure the experiment. Sometimes the analysts and PMs will go back and they'll do a deeper analysis of what we observed and say, hey, I said that this metric was going to be our decision-making metric, this conversion rate. Well, we studied the problem more and it doesn't impact enough customers to actually change that thing enough that we would ever be able to resolve an experiment. But it actually makes a really big difference on helping the customer complete their task. And so maybe I can look at the secondary metric and show you that's happening. Now you have to be careful though. If you're running tests and every time you don't get the answer you want, you just go and find a secondary metric that says the thing you want it to say, like you'll actually make a bunch of really bad decisions. Like you'll have a ton of bias in your decision-making process. So that's why those cases we go, oh, could we have defined that upfront earlier? And boy, we better have a really high confidence that we're not just slicing the data to tell us the story we want versus we're really independently validating the hypotheses. And so that's one of the things I love about our analytics team, our product analytics team, is they're supposed to be our objective arbiters. Now, it doesn't work perfectly. We get excited about the things we're building and our analysts will get excited and they work closely with the product teams and they feel, deep connection with them. But they also understand that part of their job is not to sugarcoat anything and to try to be really objective in terms of, do we believe or not believe that we're achieving the outcomes that we're aiming for, and in objectively measuring the impact of those things.
Very good. So can you tell us more about what tools you're using to collect and analyze data?
We use some homegrown stuff in terms of bucketing users. And I think the most important piece of it is our data visualization tools that we use. We currently use Mode, and we'll build out pretty robust A/B test dashboards for everything that we experiment with. It's plugged into our data warehouse, and then we try to construct those in a way where all the primary metrics, secondary metrics, and all kind of the cuts that we think would matter to start to tell a story narratively of what's going on is on that report, along with all the filters. So PMs and analysts can go and slice that any number of ways. Now, for different types of experiments, we may use different tools. So if we're running a market level split test, we may do a causal impact study or diff and diff analysis. And so the team may use Python, and they'll be doing some regression analysis and some libraries under the hood. Mode has been a nice tool for us because the Python is natively embedded in the dashboards, so you can kind of pull those things over. And the other, maybe one of the most important tools which may not sound as sexy as just statistics, right? I mean, um, like confidence intervals to me are my favorite thing when it comes to experimentation in the product. Like, can you, how often do people look at data and they go, oh, that thing's larger than the other thing? It's like, okay, well, right, it's larger than the other thing, but is it 2 standard deviations above? Is it 3 standard deviations above? Is it 0.05 standard deviations above? It's so easy to get excited. I do all the time. I look at reports and things we're testing. I'll be like, 2%. And you're like, yeah, and the error bars are like 8%. It doesn't mean anything. So that's probably my favorite tool. When it comes to experimentation, it's statistics.
I love hearing you talk about this. Obviously, I mean, customer insights, super central to your strategy. How's the team prioritize and then act on that feedback?
So we have a small but mighty user research team. That's a big part of that. They do a ton of interviewing, talking to customers. We have our customer support organization within ops that's constantly talking to customers, getting feedback every day on the phone, on chat, on email with them. We use a third-party tool that goes centralize all of that information and distill it down into themes that we can run through an internal program we have called Voice of the Customer. And right now that's led by our director of design. And so he helps take those themes and bring them to life within the product team on a regular basis. So they're seeing and feeling those problems. And then we're constantly, anytime we're developing business cases, there's a set of hypotheses we have. And very often we take those hypotheses and we turn them into customer surveys, or we sit down and interview customers. I mean, that's probably my favorite form of research, is talk to your customers. Like, there's just nothing better than talking to your customers and using your product. There's not a single time that I have used Rover where I'm not screenshotting like half the experiences and being like, oh, that was a little clunkier than I would have liked, or I bump into one of these little paper cuts, one of these edges.
Mm-hmm.
But if you talk to 10 customers, you'll find like 50 paper cuts or little edges. They might even be glowing. It might be super positive. But if you really talk deeply with them, they will share little things about their perceptions, things they didn't understand that you took for granted. I was talking to a customer recently, and they were doing a search on Rover for a border, and she was telling me about how just the way things were laid out on the map left this impression to her of how many providers were in her area. The impression was wrong, but her sentiment wasn't. Like, the fact that she felt that way looking at it was actually right on. The experience led her to some feeling about her ability to be successful based just on how things were sprinkled on the map and her knowledge of neighborhoods and how far away they were. And I think left me with the impression of like, ooh, we could do a better job of helping the land with her, of like, why are these the right matches for
Mm-hmm.
her? But you would really struggle to get some information like that out of a survey. It'd be impossible to get it out of an aggregate analysis of what's happening on platform.
Yeah, that's the kind of stuff that you just won't get out of all the quantifiable data, or data telemetry. Sometimes you got to talk with the actual person to understand the why behind that. A whole new type of learning that comes from there. That's amazing.
But you can take something like that and you can turn it into something that can be quantified.
Mm-hmm.
After I talked to her, I immediately went and was talking to one of our data scientists about like, hey, we can go validate this. Like, if there's experiences like her, how would we aggregate the data to be able to tell that story? you just would never, it'd be a needle in the haystack. You'd never find it starting with the data. But once you talk to customers, you can get all sorts of ideas of like, oh, if that's a real problem, I can actually cut down to a subset of the data that's going to start telling her story. And then you can start to quantify what might be the impact of making changes to the way our product functions.
Yeah, neat. So how does Rover ensure collaboration within the cross-functional teams, like product design or engineering?
Well, it's embedded in our structure. We use a pod model. We call it a pack because it's more on brand. But that starts with PM, engineering manager, design, and analytics partner. And then those four will be assigned to a pack. Sometimes an analyst may cover two packs, and sometimes it'll be one-to-one with, sometimes the same with designer, depending on what that group is focused on. And then plugging in beyond that, depending on where we're investing, usually at some point, user research will often be engaged and involved, but our user researchers usually cover several packs.
Mm.
And then data science as well, where data science may flex in to support different projects, but typically isn't assigned one-to-one to a given pack. From there, it's again, I mean, I'm probably sounding kind of boring saying the same thing over and over again, but it's about alignment on the outcomes. What are they signing up for? We use OKRs, and we look for that whole group to be really, really clear on here's the objective that we're trying to achieve. Here is a key result within the half or the quarter. Ideally, those key results are very, very clear, measurable outcomes, and they often have a bunch of strong hypotheses on why they think they can achieve those key results. Typically, we try to stay away from a project as a key result. A project is a deliverable. A key result is an outcome that we get from that deliverable. But in terms of strong partnership, if they're not aligned on that thing from the get-go, we're dead in the water. If they are aligned on that, we're not done. Then the question becomes, what are the rhythms and processes to ensure success? And one thing that as an organization, Rover gravitates towards, is something that I gravitate towards, is being process light. Meaning we want just enough process in place to make sure we're not making dumb mistakes, and that we have our eyes on the things that matter most. What do I mean by that? Every company is going to have a bunch of metrics that they say, hey, these are our most important metrics. And if that metric doesn't move for 6 months, guess who's going to stop looking at it? Everybody. It may be the most important metric in the business where you're like, this conversion rate is the key to our business. And then it doesn't do anything for a long time and people will not look at it. If you take something like that and you embed it in a process or like a rhythm and you're like, hey, every month we review these things, even if it's only for 5 minutes, you can start to ensure that those things don't slip through the cracks. So process, rhythms, they're helpful for things that over time, just in human nature, are just going to like fall by the wayside and slip through the cracks. And you can make sure they get swept up and kept in those. Yeah. If you do too much of that, you don't actually spend any time thinking about anything except how to, like, I got to go into next week's business review. I got to fill out this document. I got to fill out this 1-pager that's actually a 10-pager. And so you want to make sure what process you have is really serving a purpose. And we definitely do have process, and we'll write functional specs, and we do 1-pagers, and we have prioritization processes, but we try to keep it on the lighter weight side. And again, this leans towards what profile of PMs do we aim for? And it's ones who can accept ambiguity and a little bit of openness and can navigate those things and lean on really good communication with your business partners, the right rhythms with your core team, the right way to go escalate those things up higher, ways of rhythms where you can plug into the broader company narrative so that the leadership team is understanding the evolution of what that team's learning and what that might say about how we need to shift our overall strategic priorities or short-term goals or conflicts that are going to rise with other teams. So there needs to be outlets for all those things. The tension that I think we're always working through, and I think is always, it's always a tension, is that balance between more process to go capture all those things, but that process will inevitably choke out the time where the team can just be learning and discussing and planning and brainstorming and experimenting. And so I think that's something we're always tweaking and adjusting. And I would say as well, there's no one size fits all, even for any of our teams internally. We try to give them some latitude to figure out how each pack wants to operate. They're all working on different parts of the product. If you're working on a new business line or something new you're standing up, you probably need a lot of time every week looking at the data to see, what did we learn last week? I don't need to like wait for statistical significance when you have really small sample sizes versus talking to customers and seeing big swings in what you're changing, versus maybe a team that's working on a more scaled part of the product or an experiment. They may take 2 to 4 weeks and want to collect it, and they're trying to move something by 1 percentage point, and they got to really be dialed in.
Mm-hmm. Rover has a really impressive release cadence. How frequently are you releasing updates to your product?
Multiple times a day, multiple times an hour, sometimes. So a very high frequency.
Dozens a day.
Yeah, I'm not sure the exact number, but I'd probably have to like hop in the right Slack channel or go on GitHub and count it all up. But it's many releases a day.
Well, so how does releasing updates so frequently enable you to gather feedback and iterate so quickly?
Well, we're testing all the time. One of the biggest gates to the pace at which we can learn is how quickly can we get the data back when we're experimenting with something new. Sometimes the data that we're trying to get back is like, well, we got to talk to 10 or 15 customers and get those scheduled, and those are each an hour, and that's time consuming, and we've got to write up the analyses. But when it comes to the stuff that we're testing in the product, those experiments may take, sometimes we can get them done in a few weeks. Typically they'll run at least a week. Sometimes they need to run for months or quarters. It really depends. But a release cycle of, if we had to wait a week or a month or a quarterly release, I mean, to wait a month to go ship something, to run a month-long test and then learn something and then wait a month before you can ship the next iteration, or you find out you ship it and you immediately see customers are using it in ways you didn't imagine and it's not working right, and we can roll it back. And that team can go huddle up and go fix it in a couple of days and then go re-roll it out. I mean, all that it's just velocity. It's just pace of learning. The other one is like our attention spans are finite, right? Like you can obsess over a problem and get really, really deep into it, and you get to better outcomes and solutions. If you have to spread that out over, and now I'm going to wait a long period of time before I'm going to think about it again because I got to wait through this release cycle, I don't know what that would do, but I don't think it would do good things.
Is there any special instrumentation you're using to gather that real-time insight or product performance, after deployment?
We lean out, I would say we have 2 different layers that we have. One is like, if we break things, what's wired up to monitoring and alerting, like real-time monitoring. That's not the same tools we use for analytics. Mm-hmm. We use Datadog for real-time monitoring of like event stream data that's coming out of the product. We also make sure that the vast majority of the time, as soon as a test is launched, our monitoring dashboards from an A/B testing perspective are live. And so our product managers are typically in there. We also have try to stay really close with the operations team. We work very closely with them on our release cycles, which is hard because we release continuously. So we have to stay in lockstep with our operations and marketing team and partners who might be doing coordinated things like sending out emails or push notifications to customers and education, or our support teams. We change something in the product and our providers are going to call in because a feature is not working properly, or it is working properly, but somebody wanted help, and our ops teams need to know how to go support that stuff. And those are also super valuable channels for, we released something and there's a little edge case out in the wild that we wouldn't pick up on one of our dashboards because it's like 1% of users. But we want to make sure we're getting that stuff from our operations team and into the product. So there's all these different channels, whether it's the A/B test dashboard, it's the real-time alerting and monitoring that's more about, do we have a bug in production somewhere? And so we're throwing errors. Or we're finding out that 1% of users through our ops team are having this problem and calling in. And if we release something and in a few days, we already have a couple of calls to ops, there's probably 10 times as many customers who may not even be calling in or having that problem. And we'll want to make sure we get that back to the pack as quickly as possible. And then they can go triage. Before that, we go through QA and bug bashes and things like that. So we try to make sure that we have as few defects escaping as possible, but inevitably they will. And all those different avenues matter.
So I know building a product-led organization isn't easy. What are some of the biggest challenges you faced?
Oh, I mean, there's just trade-offs everywhere. In terms of, as a product organization, I said we focus on aligning on a set of business outcomes and customer problems that we're trying to solve.
Huh.
There's a trade-off to be had on that front alone. Tech, the underlying tech isn't organized that way. Our definition of what the strategic objectives are, what the most important customer problem is, going to change over time. And but the infrastructure and the way our code base is organized is not necessarily going to change in those same sorts of ways. So I think that's one challenge we have, is as those priorities shift, it may be that the technical component ownership sits on one team over here, and you got to make trade-off decisions. Does that team lean in? Does this other team work out of their code base? Mm-hmm. We have a shared code base, so anybody across our teams can in principle work on things, but there's strong subject matter expertise and domain that can slow us down at times and make for difficult trade-off decisions. So that's I'd say that's one material challenge. The other one is we encourage our PMs to embrace ambiguity and think beyond the boundaries of their own team. Where can that go wrong? I mean, one thing that some folks love is like, hey, just give me a lane and let me just work in this. And I don't have to bump into anybody, and I can probably work a little faster, a little bit more independent, but I'm also probably going to take on a smaller and narrower set of problems. And so for us and where we are in our stage, we don't want somebody just like micro testing colors on one little landing page, and like doing like super, super focused work. It's simpler in a lot of ways. You can probably work faster because you're not going to bump into other teams. But when we push people to embrace ambiguity and, worry less about what's their specific domain ownership as opposed to what's going to be most effective at achieving this set of outcomes, that means they're going to bump into other teams and they're going to blur those boundaries. And so that has a lot to do with what's the profile of PM we look for and how do we operate culturally. Mm-hmm. But that just inevitably, has its own challenges that I think we try to really embrace as an organization, but are hard.
I want to hear more about the cultural practices. I mean, what have you found to be, really critical to sustaining the product-led organization from a culture standpoint?
Earlier I said we have no office politics. One thing we mean by that is we don't, individuals don't prioritize their own short-term career objectives over what's right for the customer and what's right for the business. And I say short-term because long-term, all of our employees have, something they're trying to develop, someplace they're trying to go in their career, and we want to help them get there. Whether that's inside Rover, outside Rover, if there's something they want to develop, we want to take them as far as they can. Love for that to be inside Rover, but if taking them as far as we can means we get them up to a point where the next step is outside of Rover, that's great. We want to help people in their careers. We want to help them develop. But when I say we don't prioritize our own short-term career objectives, that means we don't do things that are artificial or not in the best interest of our customers just so I can grow my team a little bit one quarter over the next. But it also puts people in a position where we try to take advantage of that in the sense of we want people to know that they can take risks and they can experiment with things. And if the answer is, this is bad for business, that's what we've learned. Like, this product is going to fail and I proved it to you faster. Like, we don't want that person to be like, oh crap, the project I was working on failed. I've got to go make it look like it didn't fail. Right? We want them to know success is that thing isn't going to work out. That's a little scary though. If you're working on a project and you're like, I'm going to show you how quickly I can fail this project from a career perspective. But we have lots of leaders. And I think the best thing is just to look by example where we put people in charge of testing out a new business line. And they're like, this thing is either going to succeed or I'm going to try to kill it as fast as possible if I get data that says it's not viable, and know that the business is going to rally around me and help find the next project for me, that I'm not just tethered to the outcome of this one thing, even when it doesn't make sense. So that's one.
That's awesome. I mean, creating that safe environment, it's safe to fail, and people aren't punished from that. We focus on the learning.
And it's still scary. I mean, I'm not going to tell you it's not scary, but I hope that our team members feel that way. And I know a lot of them that I've talked to have. Another one that I love is one of our values, discipline in the way we debate, which has two components that I've internalized over the years. One of them is we get the right people in the room when we're making a decision. We work really hard to have a single point decision maker, somebody who owns a decision. And so earlier you asked about pushing how do you enable empowerment? One of the best ways to enable empowerment is be really clear with who owns a decision. Sure. And so we try to put our PMs in a position where if they own something, they know where they're free to iterate and make the decisions, and they know what decisions sit elsewhere where they may be in a recommender position. But when it comes to making those decisions, we don't just try to cram things over the line. Whoever owns that decision does have a responsibility to get input from their stakeholders and share those things out. And if there's a key stakeholder who needs to be a part of a decision and maybe a voice of opposition, we have an obligation to make sure they're in the room to be a part of the conversation. And not wait for them to be on vacation and then be like, we're going to have this meeting. We're just going to cram this thing over the line. So that's one part of it. The other part, which you feel daily at Rover, which I absolutely love, which is we disagree by offering suggestions. And it's a really, really powerful thing. What it does is it means that, Jeff, you propose something that I'm like, that doesn't make any sense. Here's all the reasons that's a bad idea. If all of a sudden I have to go think through a suggestion that's a counterpoint to yours, if I start thinking through all the other ideas and I'm like, oh my God, these are all way worse, it may be that you're just proposing the least bad thing to do. But just the act of having to go through and think through what's a good counter suggestion actually forces you to engage with the problem in a materially different way. And it forces you to become a collaborator. And you see this every day at Rover. People, when they disagree, they either offer suggestions, and then every once in a while somebody goes, okay, I can't think of an alternative. I'm sorry, but like, here's some set of problems. But they'll even acknowledge it, and they'll often say something like, "I'm going to go back and think about like if I have a good counter suggestion." But there's a feeling of obligation, and it takes um, the teeth out of things in a way where we can disagree all over the place, and disagreement's really important. But it really does feel like we're all on the same team, and it just makes it feel like everybody's in it with you, as opposed to I'm just going to throw darts and rip your work to shred, and I'm not going to offer anything constructive. If that happens, that is off values behavior, and it's become the sort of thing, it sticks out like a sore thumb at Rover if people do that.
Oh, I love this. Well, so how about leadership lessons? What have you learned in fostering a strong product culture?
One is the importance of narrative and understanding why. I mean, my background's in hard sciences, and so data analysis and those things come really naturally to me, and kind of our basic expectation. That in it is net in and of itself like really good analytical acumen for your organization, and tracking of data is necessary but not sufficient. The most important part is the storytelling with that data and the narrative, and tying that back to the customer. And more and more over time, I've come to like, so it's all about the why. Like, you can't really just, if you don't understand why, you don't have strong hypotheses, the data doesn't really do very much for you.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say as time goes on, I come to appreciate more and more deeply the subject matter expertise within my teams who can unpack that. Um, at a leadership level, sure, it's important that we're developing those narratives that are broad across the entire business. But though it feeds all of that is like the learnings out of each of our PMs and designers and user researchers and analysts that are actually taking these higher level objectives and problems and starting to bring them to life with like deep and very focused and very particular narratives around our customer base. And so I think over time, I just become so incredibly appreciative of how much we can learn about our product and our customers by empowering all of them. And that's why, empowerment of our teams is so critical, because I feel like if you're doing that right, that information is flowing up and across the organization. And to me, that's just the backbone of a good product team.
That's beautiful. So, Matt, thank you so much for coming on the show. If people want to learn more about you and Rover, where can they go?
If you have pet care needs, go to rover.com to find a sitter or walker for your dogs. If you want to learn more about careers at Rover, you can go to rover.com/careers and learn about a lot of the different roles that we have open. Or you can learn about our leadership team. And you can find me on LinkedIn, Matthew Sternberg.
Okay. Well, Matt, thanks again for being on here. And thank you to our listeners for listening. If you don't want to miss another episode, just click subscribe or like, and definitely leave us a comment or a review. That always helps us see how we're doing with our guests and make sure we target the right people you want to hear too. So thank you so much for listening. We'll be back soon.
Thanks, Chuck.
Thanks, Matt.